Ghislaine Maxwell grew up in palaces. Literally. She was the daughter of a publishing tycoon, raised among the British aristocracy, friends with princes, royals, diplomats. The kind of people who inherit power rather than earn it. She sailed yachts, attended Oxford and dined with presidents. She didn't date money, she was born into it. She didn't chase status, she embodied it. And yet, somehow, a woman who lived at the top of society became a recruiter for one of the most prolific sex trafficking operations in modern history. That contradiction is the heart of this story. Because if Jeffrey Epstein's rise is impossible to explain financially, Ghislaine Maxwell's fall is impossible to explain morally. So how does a woman raised with titles, access, and royal approval become the shadow architect behind Epstein's abuse? Why did girls say she scouted them, groomed them, and normalized him? And maybe the darkest question of all, did she choose this life? Or did something break inside her long before she met Epstein? Welcome back to Inquisitive, Episode 2 of our deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein. Not just the man, but the network that made him possible. In Episode 1, we followed the money, Wexner, the banks, the Virgin Islands, but financial power is only one side of the machine. Today, we follow the social power, the invitations, the elite introductions, the recruiting pipeline, and the woman who helped engineer it. If you want to follow the entire story as each episode drops, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell so you don't miss a single episode. Ghislaine wasn't just wealthy. She was raised in a monarchy of media. Her father, Robert Maxwell, controlled publishing empires across Europe. He owned newspapers, manipulation tools, and political leverage. He treated politicians like chess pieces and his children like extensions of his empire. Ghislaine grew up inside a world where power was normal and affection was transactional. She attended Oxford, she worked at his papers, she was photographed with royalty. The life she knew was helicopters, champagne, and influence. But underneath the glamour, there were cracks, especially in her father. Robert Maxwell was later accused of stealing hundreds of millions from his company's pension funds. In 1991, he died under mysterious circumstances. He was found floating off his yacht. Suicide? Accident? Assassination? The investigations never fully satisfied the world. For Ghislaine, his death wasn't just a scandal, it was a collapse. She lost money, protection, status. The family empire dissolved almost overnight. And for the first time, Ghislaine needed a new source of power. Enter Jeffrey Epstein. When Ghislaine meets Epstein in the early 1990s, she is vulnerable, socially displaced, financially exposed, and grieving the only man who ever dictated her life. Most reporting suggests that Ghislaine and Epstein first met through her father's social and financial network in the late 1980s, when Epstein circulated among the same elite circles. After his death in 1991 and the collapse of the Maxwell empire, Ghislaine relocated to New York and became closely attached to Epstein socially, financially, and eventually operationally. There's no confirmed first meeting, only overlapping networks that became a partnership once she needed a new source of power. Epstein becomes a replacement, a father figure, a financier, a gatekeeper to American power. Some former friends said she seemed emotionally dependent. Others said she was strategic. But whatever drew them together, she didn't just support his lifestyle. She upgraded it. She had the Rolodex, the mannerisms, the aristocratic polish. If Epstein bought his way into rooms, Ghislaine escorted him through the front door. If Epstein's money opened doors, Ghislaine Maxwell helped guide the victims through them. Not kicking, not screaming, but quietly, systematically, and with just enough emotional disarming to make girls doubt their instincts. Survivors describe a pattern. A girl would be spotted at a mall, a school, a summer program, a park. Sometimes Ghislaine approached them directly. Sometimes she sent another girl. The pitch was almost always the same: money, opportunity, connections. Modelling, tutoring, work, a chance to be seen. Once inside Epstein's orbit, Maxwell allegedly became the point of comfort. The reassuring woman in the room. Many survivors said she made the abuse feel normal by being physically present, or casually instructing girls on how to please him. In testimony, one survivor recalled that Maxwell told her which massage oils to use. Another said Maxwell laughed during the encounters as if nothing horrifying was happening. And that was part of the machinery. If Epstein was the demand, Ghislaine engineered the supply, invitations, instructions, the emotional softening. Survivors often describe Maxwell as the good cop. The elegant woman who said, "You look so mature for your age." The woman who told parents she'd take care of their daughters. The woman who sat beside Epstein on private flights and acted like a chaperone instead of a co-conspirator. In sworn testimony, several young women said Ghislaine didn't just recruit. She trained, creating scripts of flattery and coercion. In the psychological literature, this is grooming. Establishing trust, exploiting insecurity, offering rewards, and then blurring physical boundaries. Girls talked about Ghislaine the way cult members talk about handlers, approachable, charismatic, charming, until you were in too deep. Until you were isolated. Until you were silenced. And the pipeline wasn't small. The Palm Beach logs show a pattern of young recruits flowing through the mansion. The flight manifests, the phone messages, the notebooks, they don't just imply scale, they imply infrastructure. Because to traffic miners at that volume, you don't need chaos. You need order, predictability, a system. Someone who knows how to turn a stranger into an asset, fast. That was the role prosecutors later argued Ghislaine filled. Epstein may have been the engine, but she was the ignition. For decades, Ghislaine Maxwell floated through the world untouched, protected by her name, her money, her proximity to power. That shield finally cracked in 2020. Federal prosecutors unsealed charges linking her directly to Epstein's trafficking pipeline. Conspiracy to entice minors, conspiracy to transport minors, transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and perjury for lying about her role under oath. The government's argument was simple. Epstein didn't operate alone. The machine required two gears, the man who demanded and the woman who delivered. The courtroom became a collision of two realities. A woman who once dined with royalty, now sitting masked and silent beside her legal team, while survivors took the stand and described what they said she did to them as teenagers. No secret client lists, no intelligence theories, just testimony. One survivor recalled being recruited at 14, introduced to Epstein by Ghislaine, coached on how to give massages, and rewarded with cash. Another described Maxwell's presence as permission, saying essentially, if she thinks this is fine, maybe it's fine. The prosecution built its case around behavior, pattern, and consistency. A system of grooming across state lines, a trusted female intermediary. The normalization of abuse. Financial paper trails, flight logs, phone records, household staff messages, nothing sensational, just pure volume. Maxwell's defense argued she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes after his death. That the government needed someone to blame. They attacked witness memory. They suggested motivations of money or attention. They insisted Ghislaine was innocent. But the jury didn't buy it. In December 2021, Maxwell was convicted on 5 of 6 federal counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. She was later sentenced to 20 years in prison. As the verdict was read, prosecutors called it justice. Survivors called it a beginning. And Maxwell? She showed little visible reaction, the same poised restraint she carried through most of her life. Her lawyers immediately vowed appeals. And in the background, the question lingered. Was this accountability? Or was it the legal system making peace with the fact that Epstein died before a jury ever heard his case? Because Maxwell wasn't the architect. She was the facilitator, the recruiter, the shadow operating behind the wealth. And while she was sentenced, the men who flew on planes, visited islands, funded operations, and benefited from silence still remain unnamed in courtrooms. That uncomfortable asymmetry, one woman in prison, dozens of powerful men untouched, is part of why public suspicion refuses to die. Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction was supposed to be closure. 20 years in federal prison, case closed, justice served. But with Epstein, the clean ending never seems to stick, and Maxwell's aftermath was no different. Within weeks of her conviction, the defense seized on a new angle, jury misconduct. One juror, identified in media reports as Juror 50, spoke publicly after the verdict and said he had been sexually abused as a child. He claimed he shared his experience in the deliberation room to explain trauma and memory, and said it helped other jurors understand the survivor's testimony. The issue wasn't his past, it was the paperwork. Juror 50 had reportedly answered no on a pre-trial questionnaire asking whether he or close friends had experienced sexual abuse. That discrepancy opened a potential door to appeal, with Maxwell's team arguing he may have influenced or even coerced deliberations. A hearing was held. Juror 50 testified that he made an honest mistake, that he rushed through the form and didn't intend to mislead anyone. The judge ultimately ruled the error was not intentional, the deliberations still valid, and Maxwell's verdict would stand. So the conviction survived its first stress test, but Maxwell kept pushing. Her legal team filed appeals claiming prosecutorial overreach, improper charging, and unfair substitution of Epstein's guilt onto her shoulders. The argument wasn't subtle, that she was being punished for a dead man's crimes. Meanwhile, Maxwell began serving her sentence in federal custody. Reports say she works prison jobs, practices yoga, reads, and attempts to project calm, a familiar emotional armor. But perhaps the most startling twist was the attempt at image rehabilitation. In interviews and filings, Maxwell positioned herself not as an abuser, but as another victim of Epstein's manipulation, of media frenzy, of prosecutorial pressure. At one point, she even claimed Epstein's death was likely murder, a statement aimed squarely at conspiracy culture. That pivot from power broker to victimhood didn't land with the public. But it revealed her strategy. Maxwell cannot accept the narrative that she was central. She needs Epstein to remain the gravitational force and herself the collateral damage. And that raises the final psychological question in her arc. Is this reinvention a legal defense, a coping mechanism, or just another performance? In the months after her conviction and sentencing, Ghislaine Maxwell's story took turns that many found as strange as the scandal that put her in prison in the first place. In July 2025, Maxwell sat for a long interview with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, the second-in-command at the Department of Justice, and a former personal attorney for President Donald J. Trump. She answered questions for hours about Epstein's network, about dozens of people, and according to her legal team, she didn't hold anything back. Her answers were documented under limited immunity, meaning prosecutors could use her truthful testimony in certain ways, but couldn't turn her responses back against her. What made the meeting controversial and raised eyebrows across Washington was not just that a top DOJ official personally interviewed an incarcerated person. It was the optics. Blanche was someone with deep ties to the Trump world, and soon after that session, Maxwell was transferred from a Florida federal prison to a minimum security prison camp in Texas, a facility known for dormitory-style housing, low fences, and a relatively light staff presence compared with traditional prisons. The Bureau of Prisons insisted there was no preferential treatment and that the move was routine. But critics saw it differently. Some victims and commentators called the timing suspicious. Some lawmakers went even further, arguing that placing a convicted trafficker in one of the federal system's lowest security facilities, essentially the club-fed end of incarceration, smacks of leniency. The political chatter didn't stop there. Maxwell still has an active appeal underway, and her attorneys have even filed habeas petitions arguing that new evidence and alleged constitutional violations could overturn her conviction. Claims that, if accepted, would upend years of legal precedent. These filings arrived as the government prepared to release thousands of pages of Epstein-related records under a new law mandating transparency. In the court of public opinion, as well as in political halls, speculation has run wild. Some commentators have floated the idea that Maxwell could be used as a bargaining chip, her cooperation offered in exchange for leniency. In theory, one mechanism could be a presidential pardon or commutation, one of the broadest powers any chief executive holds. Presidents can do it for virtually any federal offender, with very few legal limits. Yet, despite the chatter, President Trump himself has publicly said he has not considered pardoning Maxwell, noting that no one has formally asked him to, and that it's not something he's currently contemplating. For his part, Trump has distanced himself from Maxwell, while also promising transparency on the Epstein files, even as that release has unfolded more slowly and with more redactions than many expected. Meanwhile, opponents of any clemency, including members of Congress and advocates for survivors, have pushed back forcefully. Resolutions were introduced formally opposing a pardon or commutation, with lawmakers arguing that doing so would deny survivors the justice they were promised and undermine faith in the legal system. There have even been whistleblower claims alleging that Maxwell has received unusual accommodations in her current facility: customized meals, special meeting arrangements, and assistance with paperwork. Though these accounts are based on political complaints and have not been independently verified. What's clear is that her treatment behind bars has become yet another piece of the broader controversy around Epstein's legacy. So as Maxwell navigates appeals, a politically charged interview, and mounting speculation about her future, the real question becomes, is her fate being driven by justice or by influence? And in a world where power bends rules for the powerful, is it even possible to know which is which? Ghislaine Maxwell did not invent Jeffrey Epstein. She didn't create his appetite, his wealth, or his network. But she did something just as dangerous. She normalized it. She used class to lower defenses. She used femininity to signal safety. She used elite access to create a pipeline. She was the social camouflage that made the abuse look like opportunity and made teenagers doubt their own instincts. We've heard the legal language: conspiracy, sex trafficking, transport of a minor. But beneath those statutes is something simpler and more devastating. A woman who taught victims to ignore the alarm bell in their own bodies. She came from a family where power was currency and affection had conditions. She migrated toward a man who rewarded obedience and punished dissent. Maybe she saw herself as indispensable. Maybe she saw herself as trapped. Maybe she simply didn't care. The court system made its judgment. A jury heard the testimony. A judge pronounced a sentence. But that still leaves a harder verdict, the moral one. And the accounting doesn't end with a prison term. Because the people most changed by her story aren't the prosecutors, or the financiers, or the commentators. They are the survivors, the women who grew up with trauma wired into their nervous systems. The women who had to rebuild lives after being told they were special, only to discover they were prey. In our next episode, their voices become the center of the story. Not the billionaires, not the headlines. The girls, now women, who refuse to be erased. Because in the Epstein machine, money opened doors. Ghislaine held them open, but the cost was measured in people. So if you want to hear the truth from the only people who lived it, not the enablers, not the institutions, but those who survived, make sure you're subscribed to Info Inquisitive, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments which questions you want answered when we talk about the victims. This story goes deeper, and the only way to follow it is together.